Mr. Williams, could you confirm that you can hear us and indicate your presence?
I can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. Ms. Monty? Here. Ms. Dubinsky?
Here, sorry.
No problem. Mr. Minor? Mr. Koenig? Mr. Condor?
Here.
And Ms. Jacobs is running a little, oh, she is, yeah, there you go.
Great, thank you. So are there any members of the public present who would like to provide comment, which is over 3 minutes per speaker, and Ms. Shackelford keeps time.
Sure thing.
Please come on up to the lectern.
You might want to go around this way.
All right. Tell us
Yeah.
your name and
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart Gardner, resident of Charlottesville. I have a background in transportation. I currently work in transportation advocacy. I'm also on the board of the Citizens Transportation Advisory Committee. However, today I'm just representing myself and not the committee. So I understand today you're going to be briefed on proposed changes to Smart Scale. Smart Scale has done great things for Virginia, added a lot more transparency into what programs get chosen to be funded, how that process works. But there are a couple of proposed changes that you're going to be briefed on today that I want to just highlight for you all. The first is proposed changes would greatly reduce the funding available for transit, bike, and pedestrian projects. Transit, bike, and pedestrian projects, reduce funding for those things. I think our community wants those types of projects, wants those types of infrastructure funded. And I think it goes without saying that those types of forms of transportation are cleaner and should be types of things that we should be encouraging as a community, not discouraging. Second, by eliminating or reducing land use as a separate evaluation factor, we're basically failing to encourage smart growth. Okay, economic development, land use, transportation, these things should be evolving together. They should be considered together as we make transportation planning funding decisions. Both of these proposed changes in Smart Scale could limit the ability to do that. So that's all the time. I just want to say thank you.
thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes, sir. For that.
Hi, my name is Paul Grady. I live just outside of Rose, and I actually have a request. As Ann can attest, I made about 10 presentations to the chart committee in 2002 and 2003 of transportation projects. Actually, one of them made it in the 2025 plan, only to discover later that we didn't need it. So I would like to ask the board if I could make 2 presentations to you in the next couple of months. One would be a short one, one would be a fairly long.
I would need to know a little bit more about the presentations and talk with my colleagues about what that would involve. Could you email us what you're interested in doing and then we can work that in?
Well, I can tell you that the short one would be 2 revenue sharing projects,
Okay.
one in the city and one in the county, that might result in a third party picking up part or most or all of the city or county share of the revenue sharing. Okay. The other one would be a fairly large project that has to do with the hydraulic 29-250.
Interview, since this isn't really a time for question and answer per se, maybe you could, I'm happy to give you my email address, and I think you probably have Sandy's as well.
I do.
You can email us with what you're willing to talk about. We'll see if we can find some way to engage you on that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for your advocacy in the past. Okay, yes, sir, Mr. Krebs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Krebs from the Piedmont Environmental Council. I was going to talk about the changes to Smart Scale, but they were very well presented just now. I would go further to add that the changes that are prescribed or that are envisioned are they're not only philosophically bad, they're kind of in conflict with the planning direction of both the city and the county and UVA, to be honest, about sustainability, smart land use, and so forth. At PC, we're watching this, and we're very concerned about what's happening with Smart Scale. To imagine that by addressing congestion, you're not somehow doing land use planning is actually just disingenuous. We would like the full picture of land use to be included in the Smart Scale algorithm, which isn't perfect, but it's pretty great. Then also just secondarily, I wanted to just express my own personal, but I think PC would agree that it's so great that you guys are planning to work with the next MPO. I don't know what the acronym is, the SAW.
And Honda Serving.
There you go, the SAW MPO. That kind of collaboration, I think it is great, and so happy to see it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Any other persons in the room? Is there anyone online who'd like to speak? Okay. We'll close that time that matters from the public. So we have the agenda in front of us. It's online on the webpage. There is a request for staff to add an item to the agenda, which is a discussion of updates to the funding formula for MPOs. So I would ask please for a motion to accept the agenda with the additional discussion item.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. I think we just raise hands. Is that right? All in favor for accepting the amended agenda? Okay. Anyone opposed? All right, motion carries. Okay, so July 26, 2023 meeting minutes. Are there any revisions needed to the minutes as presented? Could I have a motion, please, to adopt the meeting minutes? Have a second, please. Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anyone wants to abstain? Okay, we have the meeting minutes. Great, so let's see back to the agenda. The fourth item, FY 24-27 transportation improvement program amendment. And the Shackelford explaining it, yes.
Yes. So as you may recall, we approved the 24-27 transportation improvement program not that long ago, but we did receive a request from the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, which is the new authority in Virginia. They split out sort of the freight rail and passenger rail operations. So this is the new entity that was created to oversee the passenger rail. They got confirmation that they were able to use CMAQ, the congestion mitigation and air quality funding, in order to support state-supported passenger rail service. So what they would like to do is they would like to use some of the CMAQ funding to support improved services between Roanoke and the eastern part of the state. And so what they are doing right now is going through a series of requests to add the allocations for the CMAQ funding just based on the service within each of the MPOs that would have the service sort of transversing it. So the request would be to add $9.2 million just about for between fiscal years 24 and 27 of CMAQ funding to our transportation improvement plan to support the passenger rail service from Roanoke. Yes.
Where does it come from? And locally, and is the passenger rail coming through?
It is coming through our rails. I do not know if this is explicitly supporting additional service in Charlottesville, though.
Well, we have on the East West River right now anyway, so it would be additional, I think, for us to get a vision.
Correct. Yeah.
But it is on our track.
Correct.
Okay, and this is coming from other local revenue funds.
No, this is additional funding beyond what has already been allocated to our MPO. So we, the MPO technical committee did recommend approval of this, so we would just need to confirm with you all that you would like to vote to approve this request.
So this is basically our agreement to amend the plan that's on existence.
Mhm.
The funding for this comes from FHWA.
Yeah, it comes through, there's federal funding for, and this isn't a program that we get a lot of funding from, so you'll have to, you know, sorry, excuse my lack of understanding exactly where the federal source is, but it's federal money through the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Fund.
Okay, great. Do you have any questions on it? Yeah. Okay, could I please have a motion to approve this amendment? So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Okay, I'll call for the vote. All in favor of accepting this amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any objections? That carries. I guess we need to sign this
Yes,
pretty before we're done.
yes, before you leave, if you don't mind.
And for future research, is the map removed somewhere?
We can request it and send that out if you'd like for us to. Yep.
Whole another series of information. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So I forgot to mention this at the start of the microphones. I'm gonna do it, you know, it's apropos to the moving toward 2050, I think. So there was a crash this morning on 29, is that right? In which two people died. And then there was also a crash, thank you, sir. On this head. On 250, you know, roads. You know, we only, I guess, bring this up just to sort of explore back what to do is important in real world ramifications. I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to mention about that, or you got any commentary you guys had.
Yeah, I will say that the last 3 months, we have had just not just in this region, but in the whole 9 counties, you know, district, we have had quite a few big items. So it's in vehicles, and multiple vehicles, some had 3 months of vehicle. We investigate all the fatalities, determine what was the cause, we do wait for the police department to investigate first. So
You're still waiting on those reports?
I got a report from one there in Ohio, but they have not included. That was a single lead.
Yeah, it was going west. Or south.
It was going south, yeah, okay. So, I mean, single vehicle. I don't know if there's anything that was wrong with geometry of the road or anything else that, you know, potentially prevented that actually we wait for the report to be done. And then we go out and see if there's anything from a transportation perspective that we need to do to enhance the road to prevent fatality.
Yeah, that'd be interesting when you get further down the road. I don't know about that. Okay. So, thank you.
One quick follow-up. So please let me know if you do not have one of the elements. That was here 2 days ago, we had 2 roads, like 246 days. So, the car was, the first one recorded completely. It's not, I don't know if it's like, I think it's threshold, so if it is something later already, we can try to get that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're at the moving toward 2050 update.
Yes,
Ms. Shackelford is going to provide a review of public engagement efforts to date.
yes. So we've been working through this month to get out into the community and to hear feedback right now. So this is just a summary of where we are at this point. starting in February, we held some different stakeholder committee meetings with different segments of the population. So we had 25 people participate in that. And then you're welcome to come up to the table if you'd like to. Yeah. And then we started with some virtual informational webinar and a drop-in open house at our office right here. And that had fairly low attendance, which we weren't incredibly surprised about, but we knew that we would have to spend a lot of time and effort going out into the community to get the engagement we were hoping for. So as of this morning, actually, we got one more response this morning. We've had 315 responses on the Metric Quest survey, and UVA is going to be sending it out this week, I think. So hoping to get a little bit more, especially from the younger demographic, which is a little bit underrepresented in the survey. And then to date, we have had 9 additional public intercepts where we have been out in the community. So we've been to the transit center, we've been working with CRHA. I'm in the process of visiting all the CAC meetings. We went to the center at Belvedere and we attended 2 national night out events, both with Albemarle and Charlottesville. And so far, our in-person public engagement, we've talked to another 168 community members. And so our total outreach count to date is a little bit over 500 individuals. So we're fairly pleased that, we've had this level of response so far, understanding that there will be an additional phase of public engagement, but just wanted to let you all know, give you some progress. And of course, we still have some additional CAC meetings that we'll be attending, as well as the, CACVB, the joint visitor board between Charlottesville and Albemarle will also be speaking there. So we have a couple more to date, but we feel like we've tried especially to reach maybe what we might refer to as vulnerable populations, especially in our outreach today. So just wanted to give you a quick update on that before we get into the more technical content about the data analysis related to the plan. Any questions on the public engagement at this point?
Sounds like it's moving along.
Yeah.
May we interrupt and introduce?
Yes, please. Yes, I meant to come back to it. Thank you. Do you want to introduce yourself, Captain Bailey?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Darryl Bowers. I'm a Culpeper representative for the Commonwealth Transportation.
Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. All right, so you may recall that we got a grant through the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment to develop a performance-based prioritization process that we would be using for our long-range transportation plan. So the purpose of this is to help us develop a process that we would that we would apply to the data analysis aspect of identifying where there are system improvement needs in our region. So I want to start off this conversation by saying that the data is only one piece of information. So looking at the system performance, the way the numbers are telling the story, this is only one part of the story that we need to make sure that we're considering as part of the identification of the system needs. We are also asking the public in our region, where are their problems and what kinds of solutions would you like to implement? That is going to be another layer of consideration in addition to the data analysis aspect. And then the third thing that we'll also need to review and look at is to determine, is the data and the information that we're getting through the public engagement and the data analysis aligned with the locality priorities? So that's something else that we will also be considering. So we are just talking today about the data analysis part of the planning process, which is a required step in the development of long-range transportation plans. So we worked with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment to develop a scope that basically has 2 different phases. The first is that we are identifying the system needs. So we're going to start off by saying, based on our analysis of the data, where do we see the most critical needs based on the goals and objectives that we develop as a region? And then from there will be a second phase where we're actually prioritizing projects. So we're going to start looking at needs, look at where we have projects that would resolve those needs that we identify. From there, that's going to help us start limiting down the projects that we want to work through as far as prioritization and as far as developing sort of our prioritized constrained list. And then where we might have a need, but we don't have a project ready to meet that need, that would be a planning priority. So that's a gap need where we know we need to look to see what can we do to figure out what kinds of improvement we want to implement in those areas. So the general process is that, this will be kind of similar to the way the state does its prioritization. We're going to identify the measures that we're going to use to evaluate the data. We're going to calculate a raw score that will then be standardized so we can combine data from a lot of different sources together and get, relative priorities and comparison on all of these different measures that we're looking at. And then we'll be able to apply the weighting for each of those measures that we identify as part of that is informed by our public engagement in order to identify needs that consider all of our goals and measures across all of the scoring areas. Any questions about the general approach? Okay. So as a refresher, the 5 areas that are in bold represent our 5 goals that we discussed and landed on as far as what would make us feel like we were improving the transportation system in our areas. That's safety, looking at roadway and pedestrian safety, multimodal accessibility. So in this category, we're measuring access to jobs by different modes of transportation. I want you to hold that thought that probably is coming to a lot of people's minds right now about why are we focusing on jobs here, because we're going to focus on other non-work destinations in this land use coordination piece. The efficiency and economic development, this is where we are measuring the system operations as far as capacity. So we're looking at both congestion and system reliability here, as well as how any sort of system deficiencies might impact bus transit performance. And then finally, we're looking at environmental impacts. So I'm going to go through all of those. And basically what I want our outcome to be from our discussion today is to make sure that you all understand what we are measuring with this data, understand that it will be really good at measuring some things and it might not capture other things that are important. So I want you to understand the data. And then I also want to make sure that the way we are defining needs is agreed upon by you all today. So I'm not asking for a vote formally, I'm just asking for a general discussion and consensus on how you would like us to evaluate each of these performance measures. So for each of these needs, for each of those measures that we've identified, part of the scope of the project was to develop different thresholds that we would be able to utilize in terms of defining what a need is in order for that need to be considered as part of the scoring criteria. So the thresholds, the minimum threshold will determine whether or not a project is eligible to receive any score for that performance measure. And then the consultants developed 2 different threshold options for each measure, and they have different implications depending on which of the thresholds we use. So that's what I'm going to talk through today. All right. So the first performance measure we're looking at is roadway safety needs. And this is fairly straightforward. So the threshold is really based on the potential for safety improvement ranking. And so this is a predictive process that VDOT uses to sort of give you an indication of how many crashes they might anticipate would be happening at an intersection or along a roadway segment. And the potential for safety improvement is based on where there are more crashes than would be indicated through that predictive modeling process. So VDOT ranks all of these. You probably hear this when you talk about VTrans needs, or maybe when we're identifying pipeline projects, you might hear this potential for safety improvement ranking listed. So the PSI ranking is only going to indicate, again, the threshold of what should be evaluated as part of the needs criteria. The actual need is going to take that PSI ranking and look at whatever intersections or segments fall into the threshold that we choose, and then use this weighting process that's called equivalent property damage only, which basically says that we're going to look at how many crashes occur at these different levels of severity and standardizes how they're weighting. So crashes that have higher, intensities or more serious injuries or fatalities related to them are going to have higher needs indicated based on this weighting. So the actual need prioritization is going to be based on the number and severity of crashes, but the PSI ranking is going to indicate which segments and intersections would be evaluated under that next step. Does that make sense? So,
Sorry to interrupt, but for anybody who's really interested in the details of it, it is in that, it's in your packet. So if you, any one of these things that she goes into, if you really want to better understand it, there's a very detailed description of, for example, what PSI is or what some of these thresholds are.
Yeah. So the first threshold that we're discussing again related to this PSI is we can either look at all PSI intersections and segments that have 3 or more crashes in a 5-year analysis period. So basically anything that has regular crash activity there beyond what would be expected. Or we could limit this to looking at our top 10 miles of PSI segments and top 20 PSI intersections within the boundaries. The implication of the first one is that you'll have more projects that would get a safety score. The implication of the second one is we would only be focusing on the places where there are really more significant safety needs relative to the other locations throughout the region. So MPO Tech recommended using this first criteria. They felt like they wanted to capture all locations where there could be a safety improvement. And again, the really serious areas are still going to rise to the top and get a higher score regardless. But what this means is that there would be more intersections and segments that would be eligible to receive a score in that criteria. Any questions on this one?
So I read this, is that saying that 2 crashes or less is or falls into the realm of normal?
I think, I mean, obviously, if VDOT has an official position on this, feel free to jump in. I think the idea though is that we're trying to look at areas where there is where it's not just like an outlier event, where there is a consistent issue with the crashes.
Yeah, I mean, if you go west, I mean, I don't know how you weed out the weather events too. I mean, it could be snow, you could have 3 crashes go day. So I mean, I think this is going to give you a whole lot of segments that fall into a category to any rank.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're gonna get a lot. They're gonna get a lot out of that. That's 3 crashes or more in 5 years. Especially with this traffic drive.
Yes.
So the number 2 bullet, how do you balance miles and miles and miles in rural area? And because the number 2 could totally be filled out in the city and the county road area. All that stuff.
Well, yeah, that probably will likely happen because you think of where the most severe crashes are occurring, they're going to be occurring where there's a lot of traffic and where people are going high speeds. As far as the over total numbers of these, this is also dividing it into segments. So if there are, if there's more than 1 crash on a long rural road, if it's all happening within a close area, that will be captured as part of this segment. But it may not necessarily all show up as happening on the same segment in order to sort of trigger that threshold. But I think what you might be indicating with that comment, Supervisor Malik, is that you want, if there's a safety need, regardless of if it's within the top 10 or the top 10 segments or top 20 intersections, that should be captured in this process. Am I interpreting that comment correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for being much more.
So you would prefer sticking with this first threshold based on that, it sounds like.
I just have no way of predicting other than what Sean just said about if we're together in this video download, we're having a download here and not be able to do anything with it unless it's so I don't know if it's possible to have a first run of of something as a living pilot area and find out what we see. That's-
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I think my goal tonight was to start with like a philosophical discussion to see what maybe resonates with us as far as, you know, do we want to focus anywhere where there's a safety improvement that we could make, or just on the most severe crashes and be prioritizing those. But I think we can potentially do multiple iterations. This will just give us a starting point.
Did the MPO tech say a little more about why they're recommending number one, because it's more conservative perhaps?
I can maybe provide my thoughts on why they might have chosen this one, but I think, you know, we're really looking at accumulating all of these over a number of different performance measures. So it's not just the safety. We'll get a lot of you know, indicators showing up for the safety analysis, but we're going to be doing this for all of the other, I think there are 11 performance measures as well. So we're going to get a lot of intersections. What this does, though, is it helps us understand that if we have the opportunity to align a project with a funding resource, and we know that there's a safety need there, it helps us go ahead and be considering that we have an opportunity to make a safety improvement at those locations.
I think we just want to see really some clusters.
Mm-hmm.
And the clusters are going to clearly define where your issues are at that you should be focusing.
Mm-hmm.
So by looking at all the major issues that are on flow
Mm-hmm.
to the top, but you'll have all of them, but the major one.
Yeah, regardless of these, the top 10 miles of PSI segments and top 20 PSI intersections, even under this first one, are going to show us like a higher need. Yeah.
So if we go with what's been suggested, go with one, it sounds like we'll still be able to see these patterns emerge.
Yeah.
That's truly the most worst.
Yeah. We'll have to run the analysis regardless, but yes. All right.
So are people comfortable with that? He was looking for feedback, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Okay. And this just shows, I don't want to focus too much on like what's being indicated here, but this shows a little bit of what the outputs are going to look like. So, you know, and again, remember, we're going to be doing this across all of the performance measures. And so once we look at all of the needs, we'll have these maps that are showing places where there are the highest cumulative needs based on the weighting of all of our objectives. But we could also be looking at each of these performance measures individually to see what those outputs are as well.
To reiterate, she's probably going to show you a map after each one of these. Don't put too much in that map because it's for sample. It's to demonstrate what the output will look like. But I know it's easy for us to look and be like, well, wait, but it's not identifying this one space on this one road. That's not the actual data. That's just a demonstration.
Yeah. So the PSI is really focusing on the roadway crashes. So then we also want to make sure that in terms of supporting our equity approach to evaluating the system performance, as well as also supporting the climate action priorities that we've identified, that we're also looking at other modes of transportation. And so to do that, we are also using data from the pedestrian safety action plan that VDOT develops. Even though it's called a pedestrian safety action plan, the most recent version of the map also includes bike crashes and bike improvement recommendations as well. So I do want to highlight that, but VDOT is also in the process of updating this plan to better highlight that it is for vulnerable road users, which is primarily transit users, bicycle and pedestrian movements. So this is basically based on this plan. What VDOT has done is they've identified a number of priority corridors that based on their characteristics would indicate that there's a high need to implement safety improvements along those that would support pedestrian activity along those corridors. This is predictive. So the discussion in the pedestrian safety action plan is that the number of pedestrian and bicycle crashes is fairly low overall, and so it's not adequate to just look at where historic bicycle and pedestrian crashes are occurring, but you want to know what are the characteristics that would make those dangerous situations where people might need to travel. And so it's based on looking at crash history in addition to the design speed of the roads, number of lanes, traffic volumes, as well as demographics and land uses to determine where there might be characteristics where someone might need to travel along those or between activity generators within those areas. So based on that analysis, the thresholds that we would be choosing between would either be to use the top 1% of corridors that are shown here in red, which would be along primarily the larger corridors where there's higher traffic volume, or to use the top 5% of corridors, which would include, in addition to the red, would also include more of the blue areas, which are more of the local roadway systems. So MPO Tech recommended that we use the top 5% corridors, since that would better capture users regardless of how they might want to travel between destinations.
Are there any outlying rural areas?
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe there are areas outside of this. I would need to check, but I believe that this is all that is indicated in the VDOT map.
And is this looking retrospectively, or is this also proactively? And I'm thinking of children being told to walk to school in places that want to live, for example, where there's a sidewalk.
I have to go back and check what they constituted as the land uses, but it is looking at the crash history, but I think it's also looking at what the activity generators are within these areas and where people might be walking from and to. So I think schools are listed on there, but I'd need to confirm that.
So, I mean, I certainly appreciate why people want to grab the top 5%, which is the top 1%, but it looks as if the top 1% would be the whole you want to focus on. And I wonder if, you know, I just wonder if we might get more concrete results by just focusing on the 1% versus spreading the effort too, perhaps too broadly. What does he not?
I kind of tend to agree with you. I think red is a lot.
Yeah.
We're using this information also for our program, like how we're saving for the program. We're using all this information to help pinpoint areas for projects also. So once you add those up, then that's quite a bit of data that you're gonna have to go through to look at potential pedestrian combination. Now, I would dare to say that the ones in the blue are probably more difficult to solve based on the local roadways that may not have infrastructure in place to facilitate it.
And do you know, in the MPO tech meeting, if there was a kind of conversation about along the lines of
There really wasn't.
privatization or focus or what we could realistically achieve?
No, there wasn't really, honestly, there was a lot of consensus right away on this one. So there wasn't a lot of discussion on maybe potentially why they might choose one versus the other. I think some of this might just be generally being supportive of these bicycle and pedestrian projects. And again, remember, one of the requirements to qualify for funding for a lot of these programs is that projects are indicated in the long range plan. So that could also be one of the reasons that there was a desire to make this as broad as possible.
All things being equal, that the 5% more conservative, better. I just wonder, some point this become meaningless. We throw so much in.
Sure.
And I don't think we can do
I think it might give us a longer list, but we're still going to be prioritizing that. The top priorities are probably going to be pretty similar regardless. So if you want to start with the top 5% and we could run that analysis, or if you want to start with the top 1%, we can always go back and revisit that if needed.
What do you think, Aaron?
With the top 1%? Either one?
Sounds like you're saying the top 5%.
Top 5%, okay.
See what the prioritization looks like.
Okay. Were you gonna say something?
I mean, it just, looking at the fact that it says that the top 1% focuses on. Or let me just read it. Highways. Emphasize major highways,
Oh, yeah.
while the top 5% also includes the local roads. This is pedestrian safety,
Mm-hmm.
so you would think, I don't know. Now I'm trying to make up data.
Less people walking on the highways.
Well, but it's 29, it's pan tops where you have people walking. But do you really have, I guess the intersections, based on the intersections, can provide different issues for those pedestrians, but the actual pathways between the intersections are going to be very similar, would be my guess.
Yeah.
So to just box out the local roads where there's likely more pedestrian activity. I would think we'd want to capture the more pedestrian activity to see if there are safety issues where we expect there to be more folks walking than necessarily on the major corridors where they're interacting with more cars going faster. So I don't know that I'm ready to punt the local roads aspect of it. And you said this map is fairly representative of what the
This is the
1% and the 5% would be.
this is the map from the pedestrian safety action plan.
So like Key West, they see that little blue section out there by Darden Town. And then all those little blue sections to the north of the of 250. I mean, yeah, that's a major pedestrian safety issue over there in front of Darden Town, right in front of a public park that wouldn't be included if we didn't have the 5% there. So, I mean, you could probably nitpick things that don't have blue or red lines in the same way, but I'm shocked that 20 is not on there. I guess I don't know not how the 1% what defines the corridors that they're looking at to even draw the red line, but a little slice of it.
That here, that is pretty.
This is all within the MPO area. I will say probably one of the challenges with the PSAP map is it really doesn't capture anything outside of the urbanized core.
Yeah, what you need on that one? Okay.
All right. Okay. So, and again, this is, I'm not completely confident with that output, so we won't look at that one for too long. All right. This one is a little bit more complicated because we're basically developing a measure, but the multimodal accessibility is really about helping us understand where are there places where it's hard for people to travel or access jobs based on their location. And so again, we're using this, I just lost my train of thought, but we're using this, we're using jobs as sort of like our standard to understand access. But remember that we're also, we also have this land use coordination piece. And so they're kind of two different sides of the same coin. So in this place, we're saying, where can we improve access to jobs based on how people are already traveling and where they may be able to go from the locations where they're starting from. And then the land use coordination is going to measure how can we support transportation efficient land use decisions and prioritizing that of the other side. So this is really only telling us half of the story for this particular measure. So in order to capture this multimodal accessibility, we're developing a measure called potential for accessibility improvement. And what this does is that it is going to measure how many jobs are currently accessible under a current condition. And then we are developing a reference condition to say under an improved accessibility scenario, this is how many more jobs people could access. And so we're doing that for several different modes of transportation. So I can walk through this in more detail if you need it, but I'm trying to keep this pretty high level for this discussion. But I think this chart will provide a summary. So basically what we're measuring right now is, I'm going to use the bikes because I think that's a little bit easier to conceptualize. Under a bicycle level of travel stress of 1 network, which means these are very low stress, these are really low stress bicycle pathways. Basically, you would be comfortable taking your small children and riding down like a shared use path or something like that, completely separated from the road, not a lot of traffic, things like that. That's level of travel stress 1. And then the reference condition is level of travel stress 4, meaning I am a very confident bicycle rider and I am confident riding with traffic that is going quickly, and I don't mind if I'm riding right next to cars. So what this is measuring is within a 20-minute travel period, currently I can access a certain number of jobs based on this low travel stress network. Within 20 minutes, if I was able to ride on the highest stress travel network, I could reach an additional number of jobs. And so we are measuring the difference between that high travel stress condition and that low travel stress condition to say, this is the opportunity we have to improve accessibility. And then we are also, this is using kind of standardized best sort of practice for what the appropriate travel time might be for each of these travel conditions or travel modes. So for the automobile access for jobs, we are comparing how many jobs I can access now within 45 minutes under peak traffic conditions compared to how many I could access under off-peak travel conditions. So those are the two reference measures. For transit access, it's how many jobs can I access now within 45 minutes by transit compared to how many jobs could I be able to access if transit was just as efficient as vehicle travel during the same time period. So if transit was just as efficient as vehicle travel, I could access more jobs, and this would give us sort of that reference condition. And then we are doing a measure specifically for disadvantaged populations, which we're using the equity emphasis areas that were defined in VTrans to capture that. And we're looking at, again, we're using transit as the baseline for the potential for accessibility improvement for the disadvantaged populations, because that would give the greatest access to the greatest number of jobs. So, so those are the measures. Any questions on the measures here? I know this is a little bit more technical. Yes.
The general rule, expanding the bus route, one of those criteria.
Yeah, no, we're not really talking about expanding the bus route. We're talking about what are the system deficiencies? How could we improve operations? So maybe something like adding a shuttle or adding a bus travel lanes, you know, like something like that, that would improve the operations of transit. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. So, so this is one thing that I also want to clarify with this, because I think this is a little bit confusing and probably stands a little bit more time. The accessibility improvement the need may show up. It's going to be based on where people are traveling from. So people are traveling from a census block. That's their home. That's like their home. That's their residential base. They're traveling from there. And if there is a disruption on the network that prevents them from getting to a job along the network, the need is going to show up at the census block. So what is being indicated on this need is where people are coming from that makes it difficult for where they're having trouble getting to a job, but the improvement need may not be in the actual location where the need is being identified. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So if you're traveling from this census block, and this is where there's a job, you're traveling from this census block, there's a really nice shared use path, and then it just stops and you have to ride along 4 lanes of traffic through a segment of it to get to your job. The improvement is going to be where that disruption is, but the need is going to show up at the census block. So there's going to have to be some context that we apply to understand what is contributing to those needs. But it will help us understand where people are living, where they're having a hard time accessing jobs as a result of where they live. So we have these these are pretty similar for all of the performance measures, so we can talk of these as a group. But we can either consider all segments as far as the thresholds, all segments where the potential accessibility improvement is greater than 0. So kind of similar to the potential for safety improvement. If there's an opportunity to improve accessibility, we want to make sure that that receives a score, or we could focus on just the top half of those accessibility needs. And MPO Tech recommended the first threshold, looking at any accessibility improvement that is greater than 0.
Something as small as putting in ramps at intersections for people to be able to get across with wheelchairs or other transportation in places where there's approved crosswalk areas, but there's no ramps, so we can't pay for.
Potentially, yeah.
So I understand one. Second, all segments of population of PAI is greater than 1 million.
So it would basically be looking at the top 50% of accessibility improvements.
I mean, this really kind of goes back to the other points, like,
Mhm.
is this casting the net so broadly that you don't?
I mean, it's all this stuff gets piled on top of each other, so you cast it a wide net already. This just helps you find other potential areas to help you prioritize those needs you already know.
Got it.
Mhm.
This is just, this one just whooped my brain.
Sure.
But I mean, the gap, so it's a gap analysis, so. If I live in Woodbrook and I work at Stonefield, I can drive my car to work a lot faster than if I had to figure out the transit route from there to there.
Mhm.
So this would identify that, yeah, it takes you 75 minutes to do the bus, and it takes you 8 minutes at peak transportation time. The need would show up in Woodbrook.
Mhm.
The solution might show up somewhere along the path to Stonefield. What did I miss? And then if it's pedestrian, no, we did that one in a different area. So this is automobile, transit, and
No, it includes bicycle.
bicycle.
But bicycle is kind of used as a proxy for pedestrian because we don't have separate pedestrian data.
Yeah, I get it. And then as it stacks on top of each other, which is what Sean just mentioned, it's basically like color commentary to all of the data. All right, now is this a bike issue? Is this a pedestrian issue? Is it a safety issue?
Mm-hmm. I think what this could be really helpful for, though, is helping us understand where cumulatively are there places that are just harder to get from, like where are opportunities limited for certain portions of our population comparatively to others.
Well, and I mean, I think going out to do all of it makes sense, but it's 3 very different stories, like transit. Especially, I mean, I'm in the county, so transit in the county is very different than transit in the city. It's founded as a city. So when you're comparing, I mean, the gap is going to be huge between job access, car versus transit in the county. It may be that way in the city. I just don't know well enough. But I mean, the routes run more frequently.
This too is looking at each particular modality. It's saying the benchmark for the modality right now is X. And how do we take it X minus some percentage? It's focusing on each modality separately. Correct? To say this is where it is now, and this is the percentage, this is the potential PAI to take it from that. It's less sort of.
Yeah, so again, this is going to indicate needs for each of these, but we're going to be putting all of these together. We're going to be but what this will do is it will help us understand when we get to the part where we're talking about what is the right solution to address those needs. This will help give us that context to understand what is contributing to the need. Yeah. So, stick with the MPO tech recommendation on this one? Is that what I heard?
That's all we have.
Okay. Fair. And I'll just run through a couple of maps. And again, like Christine said, these are just demonstration data. But again, this probably isn't very surprising that, you know, you're going to see a lot more of these opportunities to improve accessibility in the urban core area. The transit access to jobs is largely going to be focused again on the defined urbanized area based on the census. Yeah.
It's interesting, the yellow line that's over there because there are these little roads, is that private roads, or is that near the airport?
That's the original road, the airport is just on that little spur that heads down to the curb.
Yeah.
And it's a major 10,000 across the road.
Sure. Yeah.
Green County.
And then the automobile access to jobs, that one is going to show up for the whole area. So everything is going to get a score for improved automobile access for jobs. They just might be low scores. And then this is just looking at the disadvantaged populations. Again, I don't want to get into like these maps outputs because we haven't confirmed that this is actually what the data will look like, but it gives you an indication on what each of these will look like after we run the analysis.
How do they calculate or locate or disadvantaged populations?
It's using the same process that we're using before, but it's limiting the area, the geographic area that is being considered to the equity emphasis areas, which are identified through the statewide transportation plan, which is VTrans. Yeah. All right. So the next one is related to congestion and travel time reliability. I think this one is a little bit more straightforward. We have a measure both for congestion, which is the travel time index. This is basically saying how long does it typically take me to get to you know, the place that I go to in the morning, school or work or wherever it is that you're traveling in the morning under peak hour conditions compared to how long does it take me under free flow conditions. And so that's your travel time index. Your planning time index is a measure of the system reliability. So the planning time index basically is a measure of how much variation is there in my travel time from one day to the next. And they use this 95th percentile travel time, which is basically I guess the layman's way to explain that is that if I need to be on time to my job or to school or wherever it is I'm going 95% of the time, in addition to my normal travel time with the expected delays, I need to leave an additional buffer of a certain period of time to account for variability in the road conditions. So that's the reliability. If something is congested every morning and it always takes an extra 10 minutes to get through a segment at 8 o'clock versus at 10 o'clock, it's going to have a low planning time index, even though it might have a high travel time index. But if it sometimes takes me 10 minutes and sometimes it takes me half an hour, it would have a higher planning time index. So,
is this within the growth area only, or is it taking into consideration commuters? I mean, the idea throwing out there is when there's an accident, it's before it's to that.
yeah.
Everybody bails who can, bails up to 250, and that makes 250 coming from the west.
Yeah, it includes, it's a statewide analysis, so it includes consideration for those in this analysis, but they're not actually being indicated in the maps. And I know that these are not incredibly easy to read. These are maps that are taken from VTrans, so I couldn't do a whole lot to make them a little bit more visible though, without downloading the data. And I am not the GIS technical person in our office here. So the two thresholds that were being considered here were either using this lower threshold of a TTI, a travel time index or planning time index of greater than 1.3, which basically means under congestion conditions, it takes me 30% longer to get to where I need to go, or 50% longer to get where I need to go than compared to free flow conditions. Or if we're talking about planning time, I need to leave an additional 30% of my travel time in order to get from one location. So that's kind of how you can interpret it. So we can either, again, focus on sort of any congestion concern that we might have in our transportation system right now, or we could focus on the most severe congestion and reliability concerns. And so the difference in the outputs, if we look at these are taken from VTrans, is let's see, the green lines are the planning time index, and the red are the travel time index. And you can see that, you know, there are more corridors and segments that will light up under the lower threshold. MPO Tech recommended using the higher threshold. So if we're talking about congestion, we really only want this to be considered a need if we're talking about really, really serious congestion issues. Any?
Place to start.
Okay. So the higher congestion threshold. And then, my notes. And then for the, because we also want to make sure that we're considering all the modes of transportation, we are also looking at how could we measure the reliability concerns or related to the operation of the bus system. And so we're also looking at bus on-time performance as our measure for that. So this is basically measuring how well vehicles adhere to the published schedule. So again, we're not focusing necessarily on deficiencies related to the operation of the buses, but really we want to use this as an indicator for where we can improve the transportation infrastructure to better support on-time performance. So the two measures or the two thresholds that were identified by the consultants were either to use the on-time performance for the bus system, if it for any like routes or time stops that are less than the system average from the previous year, or to use the on-time performance need where basically there's consistently not meeting the established transit performance goal of 90% at those specific time stops where they're measuring this. And the recommendation both from the city and MPO Tech was to use the system average. And I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Ben, since you're here. I won't put you on the spot.
So on-time performance is typically based on when vehicles are targeted for bus stop. So that's when the schedule is, right? The way that that's on-time performance is being measured right now is arrived at. So we have some bus stops that are showing that they're never on time. Getting there early, waiting, going in their time spot there, and then leaving on time, but it's showing that it's way early. So if we went with the second one, stops where on-time performance is less than 90%, the downtown transit center would be your number one. Because it has lots of time for drivers to lay over. They're getting there about 10, 15 minutes early before they have to park for the next departure, and they're always early. So we have some fixes we need to do behind the scenes for CAT to make their on-time performance reporting more correct. But for now, looking at how those eligibility is working, we can use the numbers that we have as long as we're looking at the system average.
Okay.
Is this a kind of a standard? What that
For on-time
of the way it's measured, so that we get rid of that.
No, you mentioned it correctly, but the on-time performance that 30 seconds early, 5 minutes late, is roughly what most agencies use, but it's not.
I would disagree with that. Usually it's never really zero. That's the thing.
Oh, so if you're early at all,
Yeah, you're not supposed to be. If you get there early, you're supposed to go.
yeah, I see.
So it's called a hot bus.
Yeah.
Y'all refer some definition on it. I do agree with you, approach to 90%. Yeah. I think a good place is 85%. So this is probably okay. If the system looks not too good, then you want to
Yeah. Okay. All right. Are we good with that? Any other discussion on this one? All right. And then again, this just shows what the outputs would look like. And yeah, you can see based on using that on-time performance threshold, the highest need would be indicated in the downtown area along the.
That's the trouble.
Yeah, along the trolley. So, all right. So this is probably the last one that will take significant explanation, but the last thing that we're measuring is this land use score. And so the data that is being used for this is also available through VTrans, which is the statewide transit or the statewide transportation plan. And they use this proprietary score called walk score. There's walk score, transit score, bike score. And basically this is a measure of a combination of different things, but it's meant to indicate where are the conditions really good for there to be a lot of places where people can walk to or take transit to or bike to without relying on a single occupancy vehicle travel or trip. And so this is basically indicating where there's high intersection density, where there are a lot of different types of I'm going to use activity centers. I don't mean it as like an officially designated activity centers, but activity generators, so things like schools and parks and grocery stores, restaurants, things like that, where people could walk. And so in this case, we are actually looking at if there is a high walk score for an area, we're going to make that a higher need, because that means that there are more destinations where people can already access to. And so if we want to support transportation efficient land use and support the goals in the comprehensive planning processes that you all are identifying and supporting the develop the walkability of your development areas, we want to prioritize places where people could access more destinations through non-vehicular movements. And so this is the data set. This is how they describe the different scores for walkability. I didn't make that up. And then this prioritization will also factor in our future growth projections. And so this, again, is just downloaded from VTrans that shows where the areas would get the different walk scores. You can see that, it's largely in the urban core that's going to have the higher walk score, but then also along the 29 corridor and then out in Crozet as well. And these, and the somewhat walkable it has a walk score of 50 or greater. And so the two thresholds is that we could either look at the walk scores just in the development area, so that would be the City of Charlottesville and the Albemarle County defined growth areas based on your comprehensive planning, or we could look at all segments within the MPO with a walk score that's greater than 49 or greater than 50. And so again, this would prioritize the areas that the places that are already in the development areas would have a higher walk score regardless. But then if there's any segment that's somewhat walkable, that would outside of the development areas in the second threshold, those would also be captured here, which may relate. I'm not sure the Albemarle County folks would have to tell me if there are any like crossroad communities that might be captured here that are outside of the development areas. And MPO Tech recommended that second threshold to use all somewhat walkable census tracts. Any questions on this one?
It's so wide.
It is, but if you look at this map, I'm not sure if the somewhat walkable areas are capturing anything that goes beyond the current development areas. So this one might have a similar outcome regardless, but I think we could probably use that one in case there are any outliers that maybe aren't showing up on the map directly, if that's what you all would prefer.
Well, it would make sense for in Albemarle where our growth area goes right up and smack dab to a rural area where all those lines are, where you're on one side of the street of Rio Road, you are in the development area, and the other side of the street, which also has a sidewalk, is the rural area. So if you only did the development area, you'd be cutting off Albemarle High School.
Oh, like some of these segments over here. Yeah.
So it would be areas that are, if you were standing there, you'd be like, oh, it's the growth area. You'd be wrong. It'd be the rural area.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, and in walkable places where you would want the information from. I mean, legitimately, yeah, when I don't want the pedestrian activity on one side of Ohio and not on the other.
Right. Okay. All right. So, and again, we'll run that analysis, and we'll do this for disadvantaged populations as well. And then the last one, there really isn't a threshold, but just so you all are aware, we're going to do this analysis on the other data points. And then we will go back at the end to determine where there are some of these environmental measures that we want to consider as well. And then there will be sort of an adjustment that is applied to the score that it gets in all these other areas based on these environmental factors. So that's going to include exposure to inland flooding or areas that are basically susceptible to a flood risk, as well as giving additional points to segments that are in distressed communities. And so these were just the adjustments. We could certainly look at reviewing whether or not these are the adjustments that we would want to make, but basically all segments that have this historic flooding exposure would get an additional adjustment to further elevate that need. And then there would be further adjustments for economically distressed communities at different tiers.
So the recommendation of both of these.
So these would be applied. These wouldn't be sort of scores that were given to determine the needs. These would be applied after we've done the other evaluation.
Okay.
Yep. So that is it. So thank you all for sticking with me through that.
Sarah, any further things you want to say about that?
Nope, I think that gives us guidance for how to run the analysis. And so we will not be discussing this in September, but hopefully by October, we'll at least have some of these measures reviewed and ready to bring back to you all.
You were having any additional questions on it?
Thank you all.
Okay, I think the next item may use some feedback. Smart scale, so you're gonna
Oh yeah.
feedback received on the proposed revision of the smart scale program, as well as some additional analysis on the changes.
Yeah, so you may recall that I had sent you all a summary of the proposed changes and just presented an opportunity to collect feedback from all of the MPO committees. So nice of it to start where I left off. So I just want to review that, as well as there were some questions that came up about what some of the implications of some of the changes might be. And so I did a little bit of a review. What I want to say, just to caveat all of this, is that this is based on my analysis, and that the CTB requested that the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment staff prepared the scenarios, a summary of scenarios per construction district that will be presented at an upcoming meeting. So obviously, if there are discrepancies, defer to what their scenarios would indicate. So the first question that I wanted to answer is, as far as reducing or limiting the number of, or the types of applications that the MPO would be eligible to submit based on the new definition that has been proposed, how many of our projects from the previous rounds would have met that definition? So for comparison, the MPO and the TJPDC submitted a total of 28 project applications between rounds 1 and 5 of Smart Scale. So we submitted 28. And these are the projects. So there are 6 of them that I'm confident of would meet that new definition, and 2 that I'm uncertain about but might meet that new definition. So out of total of those 6, maybe 8 of those projects would have been eligible for under this new change in definitions for what types of projects would be able to be funded through the high priority program. So what I will say is that all of these projects were submitted by the MPO. I think the Fontaine interchange improvement, there was one application that was not funded that was submitted by Albemarle, but otherwise the MPO has been the entity that has submitted all of these projects. So the MPO is submitting the appropriate projects, but there are other projects that have been identified as high priorities for the MPO that we would not be eligible to submit based on this proposed criteria. So just wanted to come back and close the gap on that analysis.
I guess the opposite would be too is what projects were submitted by localities that could be submitted to top priority.
None. Yeah. I looked through the projects that were submitted by Albemarle and Charlottesville as well, other than that Fontaine project, which took a few rounds to get funded. Yeah. So the other thing that I'll just
That's not a good, it's not a good thing.
well.
It says a lot of projects we were identifying under HPP, but it does also say there would be several projects that we applied for that would no longer qualify.
I guess go to.
Plan on the permissions to get things. Qualification.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering about. So this is a retrospective analysis. What does it mean going forward then?
It's a little soon to know that.
Okay.
They haven't even discussed criteria, 4 and 5, that's coming in September. So until we know what they finalize on the weighting and the categories, it's a little soon to, I mean, this is good to start getting our heads wrapped around this so that we understand. But just purely looking back and going, well, this is how it would have changed things. Well, it doesn't really matter because as Sean elegantly put it, we're going to learn how to play the new game, but the rules haven't been set for the new game yet. So yeah, there's going to be changes. Now there are going to be priorities, but then, until we understand it fully and where they fall with those weightings is going to be critical. Then we'll be able to start making some judgments about it, and then we'll all start theorizing, well, who submits what, where, based on that.
The one thing I would say though that I think is important for us all to realize is that, for example, what's not on here is the hydraulic package that originally got funded or that finally got funded. So what this means is that the MPO is absolutely the right entity to submit the full grade separated interchange improvements package that we originally wanted. And some of the other changes that are being discussed related to smart scale, I think are intended, correct me if I'm wrong, are intended to make those projects more competitive and to provide more pathways through those types of projects being funded. But if we are not able to successfully implement a project like that because it still is not competitive, what that means is that there would be the responsibility for finding an alternative that doesn't meet that criteria would fall more on the localities. Yeah.
And certainly what we are yet to understand as this evolves is what we talked about a little bit last time, 1/18/64/9, when we did one 7 years ago or so, and it was priced at average 50 million for doing it right. So all the different segments operate seamlessly. We were told that was too expensive and start again. But now I get a sense that we're looking more favorably on things that will actually do just that, to be bigger and require that proportionate amount of staff time to get it there. And then hopefully really solve the whole question. So I can't wait to find out what the next shoe is going to drop.
Sure. Yeah. So I also ran a couple of scenarios using the updated scoring methodology. So I also want to just provide the caveat that obviously as all of the program changes are being implemented, we probably would not have submitted the same slate of projects previously that we submitted this time. So again, this is meant to give you an indication of what you might see as far as changes. So under the new scoring methodology that has been proposed, which is basically removing the land use score as a standalone scoring outcome and using that as a multiplier, you'll see that, overall, I think the expectation is that project scores overall are going to generally trend downward. But remember, smart scale is all about comparing one project against other projects. So if everything is generally trending downward overall or on average, it's not necessarily going to be something that hurts us. But where you'll see the biggest reductions in like changes in the scoring outcomes is these projects, mostly small bicycle and pedestrian projects that were getting a large portion of their scores from the land use score. And so this is showing what the overall scoring outcome difference is for the projects that were submitted within the MPO region. And then again, the caveat is that this was my analysis and I did not validate this anywhere, but what that would look like is that if we submitted the same slate of projects under the proposed revisions, the only project that I believe would have been funded would have been the US 250 Peter Jefferson Parkway, which, as you recall, was later substituted out. So the asterisks indicate that these were the projects that were funded, that actually were recommended for funding in round 5. And so what you'll see is that there are a couple new projects that weren't funded that were added in. But we had no, this includes all of them in the Culpeper district. Yeah, so what wouldn't have been funded would have been the Avon Street multimodal project and the Belvedere project. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of funding, and I know there's the 12% contingency that was set aside, but basically there was $121.6 million to allocate. So this represents $118 million of funding in the district grant program, and the Belvedere project was the next project. And so depending on how strictly that 12% contingency had to be adhered to, potentially Belvedere could have been funded, but I don't know the ins and outs of that. Yeah. So just wanted to show again, though, I think probably what's important to remember is that as the program requirements change, these might not have been the projects that we would submit, but I did want you to be aware of sort of the impacts this would have on the types of projects that we did submit in the most recent round. So
and the other conversation is in September with CTD. Yes. And that's what, do we have a date for that, a specific date by chance? And is that the final conversation, or is that like a work session like the previous few with final determinations to come later?
The final,
I believe it's only 19th and 20th.
So that's the next work session.
Yes.
the all in recommendations have been indicated would be shared at the October meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just going to briefly, I sent this to you ahead of time. I just wanted to briefly go through the comments that we received regarding the proposed changes. So basically related to the recommendation that we reduce the application cap from 4 applications to 2 applications. The comment received was basically how we've been performing as a region. And, you know, maybe this is reasonable, but if we're performing pretty well as a region, we might prefer more applications versus less applications. I think for the most part, we're performing pretty well. There have been a couple of projects this most recent round where we didn't have the final cost estimates completed. I don't know, Michael, you'll have to refresh my memory. I think we had all the design plans and the schematics. I think we were waiting on cost estimates and the economic development site validation after the submission deadline.
I know we did a portal estimates afterwards.
Yeah.
We had all plans done on the deadline.
Sure. So there were some outstanding items during this last round of smart scale, and then but I think as far as all the resolutions of support and things like that, we're fairly proactive about having those ready at the time of the application in general.
I would say part of that is corporate districts a little bit different than other districts.
Sure.
We sort of hire consultants that help all our localities prepare their plans and estimates. So patting ourselves on the back, I think as a district, we do decently. We don't have a lot of localities on the district.
Sure.
And we're able to do a lot more. A handful of we're out there helping localities try to get their stuff done. So it is a lot of work. Everything stops when it happens. So.
Agreed.
Tier 1 entities are within. Okay. Sorry. How many tier 1 entities are within?
There's 9 counties, one's in Charlottesville, and then 4 in.
And then the MPO and the PDs, I don't know,
Yeah,
two
and
MP.
EDC and, Rappahannock.
Yeah.
And Regional Commission.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 28 total.
Well, that would be two.
It's two sort of
Each
localities.
small and 5, 4, 5, each for the large. It would be still 30 or so, 30 some.
Just randomly, and how many that came there are actually started the process?
We ended up with 38 applications, but we started with 43 or 44.
Oh, I might have been answering the wrong question on that one, but we just had a great conversation about about the application readiness. So this is about the changes to the application, like, or completeness at the time of submission. So basically it sounds like we're probably okay with this recommendation because overall we're generally performing pretty well as far as working to make sure we're getting all our materials on time. So this next question or this next discussion was about the project delivery and performance. So this was addressing the proposed change that consensus funding decisions would potentially be tied to entity performance and project delivery. So we did have some comments about how this might make sense as far as ensuring that, you know, the funding is being spent efficiently and ensuring that there is appropriate project delivery. But there was a discussion at MPO Tech about how challenges with project delivery doesn't necessarily negate the fact that there are improvements that are needed. And there needs to be clear guidance for if a locality has had some issues with past project delivery, that it is clear what steps they would need to take for that to no longer be a concern. Okay. Okay.
That's coming. All this is on that same thing.
Got it. Okay.
That's important.
Yeah. So related to the future congestion conditions, so this is regarding the proposed revision to use a 10-year future growth conditions to determine congestion benefit scores. The comment that I received was that it would make sense to consider using both existing and 10-year growth congestions in order to consider both the most imminent pressing needs as well as the future congestion considerations.
And it's been done both ways. It started off as small, I think there was a book there, and then we scaled it back and then it was.
Yeah.
But am I right in understanding that this particular change would allow much more proactive planning and building, which is certainly what citizens would like to see, as opposed to waiting for the problems. Okay.
Right. And then as far as the reduction or the defining what types of projects would be eligible for through the high priority program and defining those based on meeting these criteria, new capacity highway, managed lanes, new or improved interchanges, then the rail and fixed guideway transit improvements. I received a couple of comments on this one. I think bike ped projects should also be considered. It seems like they could figure out a way to include them in the process. And then there's also just this general concern that it seems like the smart scale projects, if this is implemented, will be driven towards larger projects for motorized modes only, which will leave some smaller regions that don't have light rail and rail services to only be able to apply for automobile centric projects.
They still don't have the grant program that they apply.
So
This change is just for the top priority, which is with the MPO and apply for locality and still apply for those type of projects. If they feel that there's.
I was one thing we talked about a planner meeting a few weeks back was the idea of using regional trail. But the definition of what regional trail was, I haven't heard yet. So I know Mike has interested, and I don't know whether he's talking about like rail line, that's the thing you control that regional, or whether they're talking something. Maybe one line, maybe more.
The only thing I would point out to this is that I think a lot of the bike ped projects that we submitted as the MPO have been multi-jurisdictional projects. So I think that could be an additional challenge because the MPO would no longer be able to apply for those multi-jurisdictional bike ped projects that we have been the applicants for previously. So this next recommendation was about basically the funding steps in the high priority program. So what happens right now is that everything is categorized into construction districts, and then the district grant program funding is allocated first. Whatever the lowest scoring funded project is and the district grant program sets the threshold for the high priority program eligible projects that would receive funding in step 2. So if a high priority program scores above the lowest scoring district grant program project, and there's enough money, and the cost doesn't exceed the total amount that was allocated for that district grant program, those are funded in step 2. And then step 3 allocates the high priority program funding on a statewide basis. I think, again, those of you who are experts in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, I think step 2 was intended to give some sort of reasonable assurance that each district would receive some of this high priority program funding. But what happens is that since the lowest scoring funded project in each construction district is based on its performance against other projects in that construction district, there's a lack of parity between projects that might be funded in construction districts where the average project cost is, or the average project score is overall lower compared to other districts. So if you're in a district where your highest scoring funded or your lowest scoring funded project is like a 2.3, and you're in a district where your lowest scoring district grant program is like a 9.7, that sets the threshold for who's going to get high priority program funding. So high priority program funding is being allocated to lower scoring projects based on which district those projects are located in. So this step would remove that step 2, and you would go immediately from allocating funding within the construction district to allocating funding based on the statewide prioritization process. This doesn't seem like it would necessarily impact our region or the outcomes of our region, but if you're in a low scoring construction district, that might have impacts on your likelihood that you would receive high priority program funding. And then we talked about the changes to the land use score, moving that from being a standalone scoring criteria to a multiplier. The comments we received is that this could make sense, but it depends on how it's weighted. And so there are a lot of factors that make it difficult to really determine whether or not this feels appropriate or not. The discussion we had in the MPO technical committee meeting is that the land use score can often act like a proxy for latent demand or other scores that aren't being captured through the other criteria. So for example, if it's a new multimodal project, there might not be a safety score, even though it would seem intuitive that there might be safety benefits that would be associated with a new pedestrian infrastructure throughout the region. So the concern is that like this land use score was kind of capturing some of that latent demand that wouldn't be captured through the scoring criteria that is established related to safety, accessibility, economic development, et cetera. Any questions or comments on this one?
I understand earlier comment, and then I think Sean made that those projects would be in the way as far as doing one of the other things or whatever, if we saw how we saw that there was a huge need for this thing.
I think if I'm reading this correctly, without the land use score, Avon probably not have scored well point period. So the locality could apply for it, but the score would still be the same depending on the rest of the projects within that cohort of projects and that round would depend on the match that funding.
Right, I understand that, but I mean, there's also it's
Yeah.
separate from what you're, which is perhaps a part of it.
And then this was related to if the land use score is no longer a standalone score, those points would have to be reallocated to other scoring criteria. And so the recommendation for our area type B is that half of the land use score, so an additional 5% be added each to safety and congestion. And I did not receive any comments on that.
That's what I didn't say, didn't understand. And I was
Yeah.
looking at environment, and it's up to -5.
Yeah, that's basically, you get points taken away if it's going to impact, like have an environmental impact on a like a wetland area or.
So that was another misunderstanding earlier, is it always felt like it should have the least impact possible to get a good. I mean, that was never really very clear, but.
I need to,
You just explain it as a punishment if you're doing that thing.
there might be a positive score too, but that is but there is a negative score associated with that.
That's the thing that we talk about, right? I mean, the land use score is really just based on where the project is.
Right.
So you've got projects that are being funded solely just on, just because of where it's at. And they're providing limited benefits to safety, congestion, or excessive. I mean, so you have projects that are funded on a majority of land use. I think that's a problem. And I mean, what I've seen here, around 5, a majority of applications are getting their funding solely on land use. 77 out of 152 have over 50% of the benefit from land use, and 40 have over 80% of the benefit from land use.
Yeah.
Why do you have, sorry, the second staff, I really think you're up to 100%.
So that goes back to the discussion we were having last time about what would happen with that land use score. So right now, basically the way land use is given its own value. So what happens is that with each of these scores, they are basically normalized against the highest scoring project in that category. So the project that gets the highest land use benefit score under this scenario would basically have a multiplier of 2, meaning that the benefits that it would receive in all of the other categories would be doubled.
Yes, sir.
And every project after that would get something less than 2.
So you're still getting the benefits of land use, but it's a multiplier on the other factors.
And then just the final comment. So this shows sort of the difference in the scenario if all of those changes were implemented on the statewide outcomes. You know, I think there is just general concern about the reduction in the overall number of bicycle and pedestrian projects from 51 to 13, whereas the number of highway projects only seem to increase by 1. Of course, the scale of the projects also increased. So even though this is only showing an increase of 1 highway project, it's also showing that more expensive or bigger projects are being funded through this. But the general feedback is that, you know, there was concern about this reduction in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure that would be funded through this program, considering that it seems like this is what a lot of the public feedback we're getting is in support of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So
That's when you emailed this to us, you were hoping this to write back at the time.
well, it was an opportunity.
Apologize.
No, it was an opportunity to, but really, I wanted to just give you all an opportunity to sort of reflect on this, to provide feedback, and then to, you know, if there's anything either in support or concerns that you have, this would be an opportunity for us to coordinate a response if that is something that you would like to express to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. But we have Mr. Byers right here, so you could also share your thoughts with him as well.
Looks like it's perhaps a corrective to perceptions of perhaps smaller projects are being done versus more substantial bigger projects. Is that the case, Sean? And then is it trying to get rural areas a little more above than? Matt, my guess is that 3 years ago, we'll be having the same conversation about the next. So it's an iterative kind of thing. So I mean, I don't know. I don't see it's horrible, but I'm very much moving this.
I don't think anything, I mean, every program needs to be.
Yeah.
So I mean.
I guess if all that into the table, we're really good with that from now. I would too, but.
I like what you been proposed, I think. The land use thing, I've heard comments that I think that's an area that needs to be fixed. On the department side, with the amount of money that's coming in transportation right now and how the market is being flooded with projects, we have to figure out a way to scale back on the amount of projects that we're looking at. So we can keep delivering. I mean, it makes no sense of submitting 60 projects and only 20 or 30 want to get something, so.
I like the point about trying to do more of the early engineering and scope definition. Because how is that gonna be funded?
That's a good question.
Well, now
I
it's like-
mean, if locality wants to move forward and try, I mean, we've got localities better now. Albemarle County just yesterday regarding projects they're looking at for revenue sharing, they hired a consultant to go out and do some work to spend every particular project today.
I guess it forces localities to put more skin in the game than do it.
Because you gotta realize, when you get funds for these projects, your estimate's not good, sure. Your budget's set on. And going before Captain Byers and CTV to ask for more money because a project is stalled or you lost an estimate, it's not a fun thing to do.
He looks pretty nice.
Yeah.
Ned or anyone else?
I think, but I think that I think something has to be done in order to give the department a chance to manage the escalation costs, because I have got scars on my back. Project that I worked on 15 years ago, really had to do with and it wasn't the lack of designing, trying, whatever, it's just that makes happen in the last 3 years, and so I think that's probably a lot of people across the Commonwealth that are facing the same thing. I've seen lots of modifications that are like years in the past. This is regardless of so.
I mean, there's multiple tools, there will remain multiple tools to get local projects or all of our projects done. So, you know.
This is just one part.
This is just one part of it, so we have to understand how to most effectively use this part. And then just like we have to understand and use the other ones as effectively as we can as well. That's why during budget season, you should always pay attention to what your electeds are doing, because that's when we make those decisions.
Okay, is there anything else you need from us? Fantastic. So I think we're at the point where y'all are supposed to give some updates.
Yep, the only real update I have is just a reminder of the joint meeting with the state and Augusta Waynesboro MPO next month. That will be in the morning. We will not have our regular meeting in the afternoon on that day. You should have received an invitation that would have looked like it came from Christine. If you did not receive that, check your spam folder, because that's where my invitation went. Christine did not actually send them out, though. It's through a
From me.
yeah.
I need to find my own spam folder.
I crushed.
So yeah. So be sure to check those. And then just a reminder that we'll continue, aside from that one, we'll continue to meet monthly just to keep working through the long range transportation plan.
Okay. Next order of business, roundtable updates. See from our friends at VDOT, anything for us?
We've got the public hearing scheduled for the Albemarle Local 2, that will be on September 19th. There's 2 meetings, September 19th, National Guard on this, and the second one is on the 21st, and that is at the center on Belvedere. So that project is moving forward for that design build. They kind of want to give this board an update that we've kind of heard some concerns about the Fontaine Avenue project that's proposed that was submitted by this body some time ago. So we're working to see if there are any other feasible alternatives. We hope to have some concepts by November. We'd like that to bring something back to this board. Once we get feedback from stakeholders, whether or not they feel alternatives are good, or do we want to continue moving forward with the Fontaine project? Right now, we weren't planning to go to a public hearing until fall of 2024 on that project. As of right now, we're kind of hitting the brakes, look at the feasibility of the ones.
Cost. Is cost is the issue or?
One of the stakeholders told what?
Are you not prepared to say at this point?
Well, no, I think there's just some concern over the design. Okay. That's what it, yes, just concern over the design of the project that's been put forward.
Okay. DRPT.
Yes, good evening. I have a very brief update for the board tonight. Just noting that we held on last Friday, August 11th, I believe, if I keep track of time, we held our post-award workshop for all of our grantees that were any recipient of any of our state program funding. A recording of that, as well as a copy of the presentation, can be found on the DRPT website. And we also, I'll provide my agency update copy to staff. There's been a notice of funding opportunity for a pilot on transit-oriented development. And so we have been encouraging any of our MPOs in conjunction with localities and transit agencies that if they are interested in those planning funds, that grant opportunity is available. And that's all I have for tonight.
Great, thank you so much. Albemarle County.
The only, I guess a quick update on our revenue sharing projects that we are looking at to apply for this year. We submitted initially five projects in the pre-application period. Recently, we had a discussion with the board about removing a couple of those. The three that we are definitely moving forward with are continuing projects previously received revenue sharing, including Commonwealth Drive and Dominion Drive sidewalks, just off hydraulic near Stonefield, and the Berkmar Drive shared use path would be the extension of the existing Berkmar shared use path that runs from Hollymead south, just across the river. We want to extend that all the way down to Woodbrook. And then the final project that we're going to move forward with is the Berkmar Drive extension to Airport Road. This is just north of Hollymead where it currently stubs out. We want to push that through to Airport Road, where it would then connect up to Lewis and Clark, which is the road that provides access to the UVA Research Park out there. The two that we are looking to not move forward with because we want to develop them further before moving forward include the Eastern Avenue South extensions, the project out in Crozet to connect from the central neighborhoods down to 250 with a bridge over the river out there, the creek out there, and so that still needs some work to figure out exactly what the funding, what the cost is on that, what the design can be to make sure we can move forward, and then also a project to sort of reshape Lamb's Lane. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but our schools did Lamb's Lane campus is where Albemarle High School is, as well as an elementary, a number of other schools, including elementary and middle schools out there. We have a master plan to sort of reshape that. That includes a lot of transportation improvements along the hydraulic and into the campus. And we are still working on developing that project. It's going to be a revenue sharing project, but we're just holding back for now. Also, just so everyone's aware, the 3-Notch Trail project, which received a federal grant for planning this year, we have been developing that with the FHWA to try and get our project agreements. We've been told that it looks like the project agreements are ready to be signed. So that means that we're going to be able to finally go out for to look for a consultant to lead that study. The 3-Notch Trail, of course, will be a bike-headed trail that connects from Charlottesville all the way up to Afton Tunnel. And then finally, we're looking at resubmitting our Reconnecting Communities grant, which was a grant project that we essentially from around just north of Hydraulic Avenue all the way up to Rivanna River, following 29 and trying to look at how we can better connect the communities on both sides of that. We had previously submitted a grant for that. It was not funded, but we were told by FHWA that it was a very strong grant and they recommended going back out for it. And so right now we're trying to have discussions to figure out how we can refine that and go back out. We've had some discussions with the City of Charlottesville about partnering up on that.
Fantastic. It's part of it. Thank you. City cleaners, yeah,
We're getting ready to do a lot of painting.
Okay, we've got our Safe Routes to School program, which switched from being more programmatic last year to being more about infrastructure. Last year, we did about 80 to 90 projects, so most of $8 on the ground. This year, we're looking to do about 145. We're working with Public Works to get those out on the ground. There are a few more concrete projects involved with that list this year. Some of the things that we put on the ground is paint last year. In the spring, we're going to be looking to put permanent concrete. The other paint job that we're doing right now is mobility hubs. So making sure our scooters aren't parked all over the sidewalks on West Main. So both of those should be rolling out over the next month. I can let Kat give their updates, but we're working with Kat on the TSP and the alternative fuel study. Both of those have, the alternative fuel study has gone through the technical analysis and developing a stakeholder engagement phase. And the CAT TSP has finished its initial public outreach around goals and objectives. And we're going through a technical analysis of performance metrics right now. We'll be coming back to the public for more engagement on potential improvements to the CAT system.
Thank you very much. Speaking of CAT, Garland, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Sorry I couldn't join you guys today. Got a lot on our plate right now. So just want to bring update. We have received 6 new large buses, 5 35-footers and 1 30-footer, which is going to help our reliability. These buses were ordered 22 months ago. So we have them now. We need to get them painted. We just got the plates. We got to get radios and all of the add-ons to make it so we can put them in service. And we actually have 1 VOC that arrived about 2 weeks ago. We're still waiting on 4 more that were ordered 19 months ago. So they're starting to trickle in. Hopefully by the next couple of months, we'll have all of our vehicles from our order from basically 2 years ago.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Reich, anything for the group?
Couple of projects, I think I told you last time, just to make sure we're doing our own micro transit operations analysis to see how I can integrate it on the service. We're making it a central part of our services. We'll be kicking off that study tomorrow. They did a rural transit needs assessment that will be kicking off September 12th. And we will also be looking at implementing a bus electric vehicle implementation study. And we're also partnering with renewable energy and building some fast charge stations in rural areas. Rural buses can't get there on a single charge, so we have a fast charging station with strategic points. Those charging stations will also be available for public use as well. So those are
Great, thank you very much. Yay.
Well, you probably noticed the students are back. And we will be receiving our first battery charged bus this fall. From what Garland said, wow, that's ours were delayed a few months. So big difference, but we'll be receiving 4 this fall. We put in the infrastructure at Parking and Transportation to have dual maintenance, dual powering for both the gas powered buses and the battery powered buses, and we'll continue converting that fleet over time. And then the last thing I was going to mention is that for those of you who know Rebecca White, she retired from DBA. So Scott Silstorf is coming from ODU. He's coming as for replacement, and he started on August 9th. So he'll start kind of, merging out into the community once he gets his feet under him. And I'm working with, as I always do, with PNT to keep things coordinated. For instance, for things that Becca and I used to coordinate on regularly, all the engagement stop to make sure that we're kind of sharing responsibilities. My assumption is that he'll continue with the RTP, but I'll check in with him on all these things to make sure that we have continuity.
Great, thank you very much. FHWA.
They're not on.
They're not on. Okay. FTA, Federal Transit Association?
Mm-mm.
No. Administration? No. Okay. Don't know about that. CTAC?
Nothing at this time.
Thanks, Lee, for being on. It's good to see you. And the TJPDC.
They're good.
All right, so we have an item that was added to the agenda, the MPO funding allocation formula update.
Yeah, and I will try, I do have slides, but I'll try to be brief. This is largely informational, but if you have feedback or guidance you want to provide, as we have these conversations, I'm certainly happy to, take your feedback. So basically, the funding that our MPO receives in order to do our regional planning work is based on a formula that, VDOT reviews every 10 years based on the updates to the census and the redefinition and the population of the new urban areas that are identified. And so this afternoon, I'm going to talk about specifically the PL funding, which comes from the VDOT or the federal highway side, but DRPT follows the same formula. So whatever VDOT ends up doing is going to also dictate our funding from DRPT as well. So in Virginia, the amount of funding that MPOs receive, remember every year we go through and we approve our unified planning work program and we say this is how much money we get. This formula is what tells us how much money we have to do that planning work. So because we completed the 2020 census and because the census updated the urban areas, we're reconsidering the formula at this point. So the current formula, our current budget in FY24 was about $257,000. And the formula is based on a base funding amount of $50,000. And then every MPO in the state gets that same base funding allocation, regardless of how big they are. And the rest of the funding is allocated based on their population. And so our current funding is $50,000 in our base funding, $156,000 in our population-based allocation, and then there's a state and local match contribution. That's the current way it's done. So a couple things that I just want you to know is that the census changed the way they designated urban areas in 2020 compared to 2010. And the MPO boundary is not the same as the urban area boundary, but the urban area boundary does inform the MPO boundary. And so these changes aren't necessarily affecting our MPO boundary, but they are affecting the population that is used to determine how much funding our MPO will receive. So the changes were that they changed from a minimum threshold of 2,500 people as far as the density requirement to constitute urban areas to basically increase the threshold. So instead of 2,500 people being the threshold to establish an urban area, it now has to have a density of 2,000 households or 5,000 people. So there's a higher threshold. And then there's also this requirement that they talk about hops and jumps. And that's if you have several clusters of urban areas that are within certain distances of each other, they're allowed to contribute to the geographic boundary of the urban areas. And so the maximum distance that these clusters could be together in order to contribute to the population of the urban area was decreased in 2020. So what that meant is that if you have a cluster that was 2 miles away from your main dense area, that would have qualified as the urban area in 2010, but it does not qualify in 2020. All right. And then this just shows right here, this is the 2010 urbanized area. The yellow part represents the areas that qualified as urbanized areas, and then the red is the MPO boundary. So the MPO boundary is based on the urbanized area, but they're not the same thing. This shows sort of the changes that occurred between 2010 and 2020 for the Charlottesville area. So you'll see that there is this portion up here in Southern Greene County that was considered urbanized in 2010. that area is no longer considered urban, but it wasn't part of our MPO boundary anyway, so that doesn't really have an impact. These red areas, though, were considered part of our urban area in 2010, and they no longer qualify as being part of our urbanized area in 2020 because of that hop jump threshold increase. And then the last thing I want to point out is that Crozet it got upgraded. It was an urbanized cluster in 2010 and 2020. They didn't distinguish between urbanized clusters and urbanized areas. So Crozet is its own urban area now. But Crozet, even though it is within the MPO boundary, the population of this area within Crozet does not count towards our population for the urban area. Because it's its own urban area, and it has never counted. Yeah, it's because it exceeds that maximum hop jump distance from the Charlottesville Albemarle urbanized area. Yeah. So anyway, so the population of Crozet does not count towards our population in these funding allocations. All that said, that's just sort of to set the context. What happened is that in some areas, fortunately not Charlottesville, Albemarle, is because of these changes in the census designation for the urban areas, the geographic area shrunk, and in some cases led to a reduction in the overall population. And so when we're talking about those population allocations or the funding that's being allocated based on the population, some areas are actually seeing reduced population, largely because of the adjustments in the urban area definition. And so if we use the same funding allocation that we were using in 2010, applying that to the updated population numbers, there are a lot of regions that would see a decline in their funding. So basically the formula is under consideration right now. There are two parts to this discussion. One of them is a review of whether or not $50,000 is the right base allocation for MPOs. So the consideration with VDOT is, do we potentially increase that to $75,000 or $100,000? And then there's also a discussion about the population-based allocations and whether or not we want to just use the 2020 census populations in the urban areas as the population for those allocations, or to use a mixture of the 2010 and 2020 census populations, which would stabilize the change in funding a little bit for regions that are seeing a more significant change in their populations between census years. So we are participating in those discussions.
What level is this happening?
This is happening. This VDOT is developing the updated funding allocation in concurrence with MPOs. So they're reaching out to MPOs. I'm reaching out to you all to let you know that this is happening, and you can give me guidance if you have any positions that you want us to move forward with in our discussions. What I want to emphasize is that our region, despite those changes in the urban area geographic boundaries, will maintain level funding and see an increase regardless of the funding allocation formula that is used. We're in a very fortunate position that way. But based on those discussions, the lowest funding allocation our MPO would receive would occur under the formula that had the $50,000 base and a combination of the 2010-2020 census populations. That would approximately be around what we're getting right now. And then the highest funding allocation to our region would occur with a $100,000 base, and then using the 2020 census population, which would increase our budget again just on the FHWA VDOT side to $312,000.
What are we reaching?
We're receiving approximately just under $260,000. So we'd see a very small increase under that first threshold, and then everything else is kind of in between.
I guess if I just said heck, I would say when you get more money.
Sure.
I'm not sure that's
so what
the case necessarily.
What
it seems like, I don't know if this is part of the discussion, it seems like something funny was going on. I mean, why they made these changes with how they did the jumps and the hops.
Yeah.
It seemed like the goal was to reduce the impact of urban areas. Was the whole mission.
It kind of was the goal because I think one of the concerns was that it was contributing to this like land grab mentality where people wanted to keep adding further and further urbanized areas into their sort of like density area. And so I think that was one of the major concerns that they were trying to address. But I mean, that all happened at the state level. What I will say is this is kind of in some respects a zero-sum game. So if we get a higher allocation, that means somebody else is getting a lower allocation. So we are participating with the Virginia Association of MPOs, who's working to try to build some consensus around this. But VDOT has had an initial meeting just to explain the different funding formula decisions, and then they will be scheduling a meeting with us in September between VDOT and the MPO staff to discuss preferred funding allocation formulas.
Go back to one slide.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just to sort of pick the middle lane, we were saying $75,000 base in the combination of two populations. That seems like maybe the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, this is not a negotiation. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it is kind of, it's really a matter of, is there a position you want us to be advocating for?
I would say advocate what seems reasonable is if you pick between 50 and 175 as the base, and then use a combination of the two census populations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of a blend.
Yeah.
That seems a little more defensible than the same. Oh, we look at what's possible.
Sure. Take kind of a moderated approach to it. Yeah, this is really mostly intended for informational purposes. I know this is at the end of a very dense meeting, but you know, we'll come back with updates, but I didn't want a final decision to be the first time you heard about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, are there any additional matters from the public? Person online. Okay, do we need a motion to close the meeting or we just close it?
Just motion to adjourn.
Okay, motion to adjourn, all in favor? Aye. Thank you. Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, Ned.
Just adjourn. Thank you.
I don't know what the rules are.
You don't have to.
Use the to adjourn and the